The first sign that something was off about the clubhouse renovation came long before anyone saw a ghost. It started with money. Like all HOA schemes, this one was sold as a community improvement project. The board announced it in the usual self-congratulatory tone at the annual meeting. The clubhouse is the heart of our neighborhood. It deserves to be restored to its former glory. The plan? A full renovation. New floors. Updated electrical work. Fresh paint. A restored grand chandelier. A complete historical restoration of the property. The cost? $750 per household. And it wasn't optional. The neighborhood revolts, but the HOA doesn't listen. The residents pushed back immediately. Why was the renovation so expensive? Did the clubhouse even need a renovation? Who approved these changes? The board, led by HOA President Rick Landry, brushed off the complaints. This is a necessary investment in our community. And as per HOA bylaws, the board has final say. That was all it took. The vote was held without real input from the residents. The renovation was approved, and the money was forcibly collected from every homeowner. The HOA had one, or at least they thought they had, because weeks later, when the renovation crew broke ground on the new foundation, that's when the real problems began. The first unsettling incident, what lies beneath the clubhouse. Most people in the neighborhood didn't think much about the clubhouse. Sure, it was historical. But how historical? That part had been buried, literally. The first signs of trouble came when the contractors started digging. They were working late one evening, removing old flooring, when the lead foreman, Mike Dawson, discovered something strange. He called Rick Landry at the HOA office. Hey, we got a situation here. Rick, irritated, drove down to the clubhouse to see what the issue was. When he arrived, he found Dawson and his crew standing around a pit in the basement floor. At first glance, it looked like they had just uncovered old foundation stones. But when Rick took a closer look, he realized the stones were something else entirely. They were tombstones, a forgotten graveyard, and the HOA's cover-up. Dawson and his crew were disturbed. This isn't right, man. We weren't told we'd be digging on a burial site. Rick wasn't fazed. This has got to be a mistake. Just some old stones. But Dawson's workers weren't buying it. One of them, a younger guy named Luis, shook his head. This ain't just some stones, man. Look at the dates. Rick crouched down and wiped the dirt from the engraving. And there it was. The date of death, 1887. And the name? Unknown. Suddenly, the pit felt a lot deeper. The HOA's secret decision, bury the evidence, move on. Rick panicked. This was exactly the kind of thing that could delay the project, or worse, shut it down completely. So he made a decision. This stays between us. Dawson's crew was reluctant, but at the end of the day, they were just workers. So the team did as they were told. They covered the pit, poured new concrete, and acted like nothing happened. The renovation continued, but something had changed. Something had woken up. Strange occurrences begin. Lights flicker, objects move. Once the new flooring was installed, strange things started happening. At first, it was small things. The night after the floor was finished, a security camera inside the clubhouse picked up motion after hours. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the chandelier, now fully restored, began to swing violently. Not just a gentle sway. Full, unnatural movement. The security footage showed no one was inside. The building was completely empty. Yet the chandelier moved like someone had shoved it with force. And then, the lights flickered. Once, twice. And then they went out completely. By the time morning came, the clubhouse was dark. The power was dead. The HOA's growing unease. Are we being watched? Rick dismissed it as a wiring issue. But the electricians who checked the system had no explanation. We rewired this place completely. There's no reason for the power to be failing like this. The problem wasn't just the lights. It was the feeling. Multiple board members reported feeling watched whenever they were inside the clubhouse alone. One night, Vice President Lisa Turner was working late in the office. She heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, slow, deliberate. She called out, "Rick, is that you?" Silence. Then 3 slow knocks on the office door. She opened it. No one was there. She didn't finish her work that night. The elderly neighbor who knew the truth. As the strange occurrences continued, HOA tried to keep it quiet, but word started spreading. And one night, an elderly resident named Martha Reynolds decided it was time to speak up. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 60 years. And when she heard about the strange events at the clubhouse, she wasn't surprised. She remembered the forgotten history of the clubhouse's land. Martha told the board something none of them had ever heard before. That land was a graveyard long before it was a clubhouse. Back in the 1800s, the site had been a pauper cemetery, a place where unclaimed bodies were buried. The town eventually built over it, thinking the graves were forgotten. But some bodies were never moved. And when the clubhouse was originally constructed in the 1930s, people reported strange occurrences even then. But over time, the history was buried. Literally. The HOA's worst fear, the haunting, is getting worse. After hearing Martha's story, the HOA board was rattled, because now they had a real problem. This wasn't just a few flickering lights. Whatever had been disturbed, it wasn't going away. And the more they ignored it, the worse it got. Little did they know, the real nightmare was just beginning. By now, everyone in the neighborhood had heard the rumors. The newly renovated clubhouse, it was haunted. People whispered about the lights flickering, the strange noises, and the security cameras picking up movement when no one was inside. But the HOA, they were in full damage control mode. Because if people believed the clubhouse was haunted, they'd start asking questions. And those questions might lead them straight to the secret buried under the new floor. Rick Landry and the rest of the board had one goal now. We shut this down. The rumors, the stories, everything. We keep control. But the problem, the haunting wasn't stopping. It was getting worse. The HOA's first mistake, dismissing the residents. At first, the board tried to act like nothing was happening. At the next HOA meeting, residents brought up the strange occurrences at the clubhouse. Why do the lights keep flickering? Why is the security system picking up movement when no one is inside? Didn't the contractors find something weird during construction? Rick shut them down immediately. This is nothing more than old wiring and faulty cameras. There is no haunting, and I don't want to hear any more rumors. The clubhouse is open. It is safe. And that was final. Or so he thought. Because the very next night, something happened that no one could ignore. The first major incident, the night of the screaming wall. On a Thursday night, the HOA hosted a small gathering at the clubhouse for their Community Enrichment Committee. A handful of homeowners attended, along with Lisa Turner, the HOA vice president. Everything seemed normal at first, until about 9:15 p.m. That's when the walls started screaming. It began as a low groan, almost like the building itself was exhaling. Then it turned into a deep guttural moan, and then a scream, loud, human, coming from inside the walls. One of the homeowners, Jeff Carter, a retired firefighter, jumped up. Did you hear that? Everyone froze. Then a loud knock from inside the wall. Then another, and another. Someone or something was trying to get out. Lisa screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as people ran for the exits. By the time the last homeowner was out the door, the noises had stopped. The clubhouse? Silent again. But no one could shake the feeling that something had been watching them. The HOA's second mistake, trying to bless the clubhouse. After the screaming walls incident, the HOA board was in full panic mode. People refused to use the clubhouse. Homeowners started talking about getting their money back. Some even suggested tearing the building down completely. Rick refused to let that happen. So, instead of admitting something was wrong, he tried to handle it quietly. He brought in a priest. Father James Morrison from the local parish arrived on a Sunday afternoon to do a simple blessing. No one outside the HOA board was told. They wanted to shut this down before it got worse. But when Father Morrison stepped inside the clubhouse, he froze. Something is wrong here. Lisa swallowed. What do you mean? He took a step forward, then stopped again. His face went pale. There are things here that do not want me here. He turned to Rick. Do you know what this place was built on? Rick hesitated. No. Father Morrison didn't believe him. But he didn't push. Instead, he began the blessing. 5 minutes later, he stopped, because all the candles he had lit blew out at the same time. I can't help you, he said, shaking his head. Whatever is here, it's not leaving. And with that, he left. Lisa and Rick stood in silence, neither one willing to admit what they were both thinking. They had made a mistake, and now they couldn't take it back. The HOA's third mistake, ignoring the elderly neighbor's warning. After Father Morrison's failed blessing, Lisa decided to talk to Martha Reynolds, the elderly woman who would reveal the clubhouse's dark history. Martha was waiting for her. I figured one of you would come knocking soon. Lisa hesitated. Martha, what were we dealing with here? Martha sighed, then nodded for Lisa to come inside. She led her to an old wooden chest sitting in her living room. Inside, a collection of newspaper clippings from the 1920s and 30s. Lisa picked one up and read the headline. Missing children linked to old graveyard. 6 disappear in 4 years. Her blood went cold. Martha nodded. It wasn't just a pauper's cemetery, Lisa. It was cursed. Lisa shook her head. That's just an old legend. Martha's face hardened. Is it? Then why is your clubhouse screaming? Lisa had no answer. The final warning, the entity makes itself known. That night, Lisa sat alone in her office at the clubhouse. She couldn't shake Martha's warning. So she made a decision. She pulled up the renovation records and searched for the names of the contractors who worked on the foundation. She dialed a number for Mike Dawson, the lead foreman. He picked up on the first ring. I was wondering when one of you would call. Lisa's stomach twisted. What do you mean? I mean, your little renovation wasn't just a renovation. Lisa's throat went dry. You know what you built over, don't you? Dawson was silent for a long time. Then he said, in a quiet voice, Lisa, we disturbed something. And it's not happy. Click. The line went dead. Lisa stared at her phone. Then, bang. A loud knock on her office door. Her breath caught. She was alone. She reached for the door handle, heart pounding. But before she could touch it, the door slowly creaked open. And standing there was no one. Just the dark, empty hallway beyond. And the overwhelming feeling that something was watching her. Lisa didn't sleep that night. The phone call with Dawson, the dark hallway, the knock on her door with no one there. It rattled her to the core. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. Just stress, exhaustion, paranoia. But deep down, she knew. This isn't stopping. It's getting worse. And she was right. Because the next morning, the haunting went public. And the entire neighborhood fell into chaos. The first mass witnessed event, the day of the shadow figure. For weeks, the haunting had been contained inside the clubhouse. Flickering lights, phantom knocks, creepy security footage. But now, it was outside. It started at 6:47 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning. Homeowner Greg Miller was walking his dog when he saw something strange. The clubhouse doors, which had been locked all night, were wide open, slowly creaking back and forth, like something had just passed through them. Then, as he got closer, he saw it. A tall, black figure standing in the second-floor window, motionless, watching him. His dog, a 90-pound retriever, froze, ears pinned back, growling low in its throat. Greg grabbed his phone and snapped a photo. And just as he did, the figure vanished. But Greg had seen it. And worse, his camera had captured it. The image wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. A tall, shadow-like figure with hollowed-out eyes, standing inside a supposedly empty building. And once the photo hit the neighborhood Facebook page, the whole community lost their minds. The HOA tries and fails to contain the panic. The HOA board was blindsided. Rick Landry called an emergency meeting. His message to the residents? There is no ghost. There is no haunting. This is just hysteria over some bad wiring and an unfortunate photo. But the problem? Greg wasn't the only one who had seen something. Other residents started coming forward. I heard voices in the clubhouse when it was empty. I saw figures moving past the windows. My dog refuses to go near that building now. And the HOA's attempts to shut it down only made people believe in the haunting more. Because if nothing was happening, why was the HOA so desperate to silence it? The night the clubhouse doors wouldn't stay closed. Then came the worst night yet. At 2:30 a.m., homeowner Emily Foster was awake in bed when she heard a loud bang outside. She peeked out her window and saw the clubhouse doors swinging open and slamming shut, over and over again. No wind, no people, just the doors moving on their own. She grabbed her phone and recorded it, posted it online, and by morning, the whole town had seen the video of the haunted clubhouse doors. Now, even the local news was interested. The HOA board starts to crack. Rick was losing it. Lisa wasn't sleeping. The other board members were whispering about resigning. And at the next HOA meeting, things exploded. A group of homeowners stood up and demanded answers. We paid for this renovation, and now no one wants to use the clubhouse. What are you going to do about it? Are you still denying that something is happening? Tell us the truth. Did the contractors find something when they were digging? Rick's face turned pale, because he realized they were getting close. Too close. This meeting is adjourned. And with that, he walked out, leaving the residents angrier than ever. The first board member quits and speaks out. The next day, HOA treasurer and Whitman resigned abruptly. People thought it was weird, but no one expected what happened next. Because that night, she sent an anonymous email to a few residents. Inside, a scan document. It was a memo from the renovation crew, dated 3 months earlier. The subject line, burial site discovered, next steps, and attached, a photo of the uncovered tombstones. The truth was out, and now the HOA couldn't hide it anymore. The neighborhood erupts in anger. By the next morning, the entire community was in an uproar. They had paid thousands of dollars for this clubhouse renovation, and the HOA had covered up a graveyard to get it done. People stormed the HOA office. They demanded a full refund of the renovation fees, an emergency town hall meeting, an investigation into the HOA's handling of the project. Rick? Nowhere to be found. Lisa? Refusing to answer her phone. The board was falling apart. And the haunting wasn't stopping. In fact, it was getting stronger. The entity shows itself, the first direct encounter. That night, 2 teenagers broke into the clubhouse. They wanted to see the ghost for themselves. One of them, Mark Peterson, had a live stream going. And as they walked inside, the air changed. Mark's phone camera flickered. Then, from the far end of the hallway, a tall, dark figure stepped into view. Mark froze. His friend, Kyle, let out a choked scream. Then, the door slammed shut behind them. Mark's phone cut to static. And when the video feed came back, the boys were outside, running for their lives. Neither of them ever spoke publicly about what they saw. But Mark, he deleted his live stream account the next day. The HOA's collapse becomes inevitable. With the proof of the burial site, the cover-up, and now multiple direct encounters, the HOA had lost all control. Homeowners filed lawsuits. The local news ran full coverage. Residents started a petition to dissolve the HOA completely, and the board started dropping like flies. Lisa resigned. The secretary resigned. The board treasurer had already left. Only Rick was left, and he was hiding. But something told Lisa the haunting wasn't done with him yet, because when she left her last HOA meeting, she saw something. A shadowy figure standing outside Rick's house, watching, waiting. For what? She wasn't sure. But she had a feeling she'd find out soon, and that terrified her. Rick Landry had spent his entire tenure as HOA president in control. He dictated policies, silenced complaints, fined homeowners into submission. But now, that control was gone, and the haunting, it wasn't just the neighborhood's problem anymore. It was his. Rick's breaking point, the night he finally believed. For weeks, Rick had ignored every sign that something was wrong, even as the other board members resigned one by one. even as lawsuits piled up, even as his own neighbors turned against him. He refused to acknowledge the truth. But the night after Lisa's resignation, that changed, because that was the night the entity came to his house. The unseen visitor. Rick had just finished packing up his office. He had no intention of resigning, not yet, but he was losing the battle, and he knew it. Sitting in his home office, glass of scotch in hand, he stared at the stack of complaint letters in front of him. Then, knock, knock, knock. He frowned. It was nearly midnight. Who the hell was knocking at this hour? Slowly, he got up and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, no one, just the empty front porch. He exhaled, annoyed, and turned back toward his office. Then, knock, knock, knock. This time, from inside the house. Rick froze. The sound was coming from the hallway, just past the stairwell, in the shadows. For the first time since this nightmare began, a cold wave of fear washed over him. Slowly, he reached for the light switch, flipped it on. Nothing there. But the second he turned back toward his office, a whisper, right behind his ear. A single word. Leave. Rick jumped back, spinning around. But the hallway was still empty. The air, however, it felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting, watching. His hands were shaking, his breathing shallow. And then, every single light in the house flickered and died. Darkness. Silence. Then, knock, 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 from the inside of his own bedroom. And this time, Rick ran. The neighborhood learns the truth. By morning, Rick was a wreck. He hadn't slept. He refused to go back inside his house. Instead, he went straight to the HOA office, looking as if he had aged 10 years overnight. Lisa, though technically no longer on the board, was already there, gathering the last of her things. The second she saw him, she knew. You saw it. Rick's jaw clenched. We need to end this. Lisa let out a bitter laugh. Oh, now you want to end it? Now that it's at your doorstep? Rick didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a stack of documents and threw them onto the table. Lisa skimmed through them. Her stomach tightened, because she recognized them. They were the HOA's original blueprints for the clubhouse. And what was at the very bottom? A handwritten note from the original surveyor. Unmarked graves detected. Approximate 12 remains. Site deemed unsuitable for residential use. Lisa's hand started to shake. You knew. Rick's face was pale. Not at first, but when the contractors found the tombstones. I looked into the records. I found this. Lisa was furious. And you still went through with it. Rick exhaled slowly, looking like a man unraveling. I thought it wouldn't matter. I thought it was just history. Just bones. I didn't believe. He stopped himself. Because now he believed. The HOA board disintegrates. Word spread fast. The moment residents found out the HOA had known about the graves, the outrage exploded into full revolt. Neighbors filed official complaints. Lawyers got involved. The local news ran the story. By the end of the week, only one member remained on the board, Rick. And when an emergency meeting was called to discuss dissolving the HOA entirely, he didn't even bother showing up, because he was too busy trying to save himself. Rick's last desperate attempt to escape the haunting. Rick had already put his house up for sale. He wanted out, away from the clubhouse, away from the neighborhood, away from whatever had followed him home. But there was one problem. The entity, it wasn't done with him. That night, as Rick packed his bags, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello. Silence. Then, in a distorted, raspy whisper, You cannot leave. Rick threw the phone across the room. His heart pounded in his chest. His house was empty, or so he thought. But suddenly, the hallway grew darker. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. And just as he turned toward the front door, a figure stepped forward. Tall, dark, hollow eyes. It opened its mouth, and every light in the house exploded. Rick's mysterious disappearance. The next morning, Rick's car was still in the driveway. But Rick, gone. His house was empty. No note, no explanation, just a shattered phone on the floor, and a single set of footprints leading from his bedroom to nowhere. Lisa was the first to find out, and though she wouldn't admit it out loud, she already knew. The entity had taken him. The aftermath, a neighborhood in fear. After Rick's disappearance, fear consumed the neighborhood. Nobody wanted to step foot in the clubhouse. Some homeowners sold their properties and left town completely, and those who stayed, they lived with a constant feeling of being watched. The entity wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, and soon it would make its next move. Rick was gone, vanished without a trace, and the entire neighborhood felt it. People spoke in whispers about his disappearance. Some believed he had skipped town. Others thought he had been driven mad. But those who had seen the entity, they knew the truth. Rick hadn't left. He had been taken. And the haunting wasn't over. It was only getting stronger. The HOA's last days, the final push to dissolve it. After Rick disappeared, the HOA was in complete free fall. There was no leadership left. No structure. No control. No one willing to step up and take charge. And so, the remaining homeowners did the only logical thing. They called an emergency meeting to officially vote the HOA out of existence. But when they gathered at the town hall, something felt off. The air was heavy. The lights flickered. And for a brief second, before the meeting even began, the entire power grid failed. A total blackout. Then, a voice, a whisper, from nowhere. This is not over. The lights snapped back on. People screamed. And at that moment, the last remnants of doubt vanished. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't hysteria. The entity was real. And it wasn't leaving. The elderly neighbor's warning, some graves should not be disturbed. After the meeting, Lisa, now just a regular homeowner like everyone else, went to see Martha Reynolds. The old woman hadn't spoken publicly since the haunting began. But when Lisa knocked on her door, Martha simply sighed. "I was wondering when you'd come." She ushered Lisa inside and poured them both a cup of tea. Lisa wasted no time. "How do we stop this?" Martha stared at her. Then slowly she shook her head. "You don't." Lisa's stomach tightened. "There has to be a way. We can't live like this." Martha exhaled slowly, setting her cup down. Then she pointed toward a framed newspaper clipping on the wall. Lisa leaned in. It was old, dated 1943. The headline, "Haunted Land, the Curse of the Forgotten Grave." Lisa's hand shook as she read through the article. It detailed a series of eerie disappearances in the 1940s, long before the neighborhood was built. Children who had gone missing near the burial site. Construction workers who had vanished without a trace. Reports of shadowy figures seen near the graves. Lisa looked up. What happened to them? Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. Same thing that happened to Rick. Lisa's breath hitched. Martha leaned forward. "Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, Lisa. And when you do, some things wake up." The last attempt to banish the entity. Despite Martha's warning, the residents weren't ready to give up. They hired spiritual experts, brought in mediums, even tried another priest. But nothing worked. The priest refused to enter the clubhouse. The psychic fainted the moment she walked inside. The ghost hunters captured disturbing EVPs, whispers saying, "This is ours. You don't belong here. Leave." And then, something horrible happened. Something that broke the town's spirit completely. The night the graves opened. On the night of the final cleansing attempt, a group of volunteers gathered near the clubhouse. They planned to salt the land, burn sage, banish the entity for good. But as they began their ritual, the ground started to sink. First, just a little. Then a full collapse. A giant sinkhole formed right where the clubhouse foundation had been renovated. The ground gave way, and beneath it, the lost graves. A row of broken, half-rotted caskets. Some of them open, some of them empty. Lisa fell backward, screaming. And just as the wind howled through the clubhouse ruins, she swore she saw them. Figures, shadows, standing just beyond the graves. Watching, waiting. That night, the neighborhood lost its will to fight. Because it wasn't just a haunting anymore. It was a warning. The HOA is dissolved, but the haunting remains. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood formally dissolved the HOA, but no one celebrated. There was no victory, no sense of freedom, just an uneasy silence. The clubhouse was abandoned. No one went near it anymore. The HOA office? Boarded up. The empty graves beneath the foundation? Left undisturbed. Because no one, not even the bravest among them, was willing to touch them again. The town council made one final decision. The clubhouse would be demolished, but the land would remain untouched. No rebuilding, no construction, nothing, because they knew. They finally understood. Some places weren't meant to be lived on. Some things weren't meant to be uncovered. And some spirits never forgive. The final fate of the neighborhood. One by one, homeowners moved away. Some sold their houses. Some simply left. Within a year, the once thriving neighborhood was nearly empty. The properties sat abandoned. The streets overgrown. And the land silent. But every now and then, a traveler passing through at night might still see a light flicker in the abandoned clubhouse. And if they listened closely, they might hear something whispering from the walls, a voice from the past, from the graves below. A single, chilling word: stay. The decision was made. The clubhouse would be demolished. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. Because despite everything, the lawsuits, the resignations, the votes, the resigning board members, nothing had stopped the haunting. Nothing had silenced the voices. And now, the town had given up trying. Instead, they had only one goal left: erase the clubhouse from existence, as if that would somehow bury the past for good. The demolition begins, and the shadows watch. The wrecking crew arrived on a cold October morning. 6 men, 3 bulldozers, 2 trucks filled with cement and dirt, ready to fill the land once it was flattened. By 10 a.m., the demolition started. The first walls came down. The grand chandelier crashed to the floor, shattering into a million pieces. The windows, once glowing with ghostly lights, finally shattered. For the first time in months, there was silence. No flickering, no whispering, no shadows in the windows. Just the sound of wood snapping and brick crumbling under the weight of steel machines. Lisa stood with the last of the remaining homeowners, watching from a distance. A cold wind blew through the crowd, but no one spoke. No one celebrated. And then, the first accident happened. The bulldozer malfunctions, an omen. The lead driver, a man named Keith Holloway, had been in the demolition business for 20 years. He wasn't superstitious. He didn't believe in ghosts. But even he felt uneasy about this job. And just as he moved his bulldozer forward to finish flattening the foundation, the machine stalled. The entire hydraulic system failed. Then his radio crackled. A voice, low, distorted, whispered his name. Keith. His breath caught. He turned to his crew. Who said that? Blank stares. Nobody had spoken. And then the engine died completely. All at once, every machine stopped working. The demolition team scrambled, checking engines, running diagnostics. Nothing. Everything was dead. Lisa felt a chill run up her spine. The wind picked up, swirling dust through the air. And in the distance, just beyond the ruins of the clubhouse, she swore she saw them. Tall, black figures, standing in the tree line, watching, waiting. A final warning, the last knock. The demolition team refused to keep working. They demanded a new crew come in. Lisa agreed. But that night, the entity made its final move. At exactly 3 a.m., a loud knocking sound echoed through the neighborhood. Not just at one house, not just in one place, but at every single home that remained standing. 1, 2, 3 knocks, each one louder than the last. The residents who had stayed woke up terrified, and those who had already moved away, somehow they heard it too. It was as if the land itself was announcing something. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped, and by sunrise, the machine started working again. The clubhouse was fully destroyed, the land flattened, buried beneath tons of dirt and cement. But the haunting, that was another story. The neighborhood becomes a ghost town, literally. One by one, the remaining homeowners left. Some refused to sell. They just abandoned their houses. The streets grew empty. Nature slowly reclaimed the land. The once pristine lawns turned into tangled weeds and overgrown brush. The houses stood vacant, their windows like hollow eyes, staring into nothing. And over time, the land became what it had always been, a graveyard. But the scariest part, the haunting never stopped. The final sightings, the haunting lives on. Over the years, people passing through town reported strange occurrences. Some saw shadowy figures moving through the ruins. Others heard whispers in the wind. And those brave enough to step onto the land, they all reported the same thing. 3 knocks. Every single time. Knock, knock, knock. And if they stayed too long, they heard a voice. A low, guttural whisper. A single word. Leave. The legend grows, and Rick's fate is sealed. The local legend of the haunted clubhouse never faded. People told stories. Teenagers dared each other to spend the night on the land. Most never did. But the few who tried, they never lasted past 3 a.m. And one day, years later, a hiker stumbled onto the property. Something caught his eye. Something buried in the dirt. It was a rusted nameplate. He brushed off the dirt. Read the words. Property of Richard Landry. Lisa, who still lived in town, got the call. She came down to see it for herself. And as she stood over the land where the clubhouse had once been, she realized the truth. Rick never left town. He was still here. And he always would be.